What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Dying Light 2. Now let's get the obvious stuff out of the way right at the beginning here. Now I actually review games after 100% pretty frequently, and I've actually made a whole video dedicated to everything that discusses. And if you're not subscribed to my channel, it's the first thing you'll see if you click on my page. My Steam profile is also public and linked in the description below. Now, that said, this is something I do pretty frequently, but with this title in particular, that might seem a little inflammatory because pre-release of Dying Light 2, Techland released a bit of marketing ahead of the game about how it would take 500 hours to completely see everything in the game. That is, story, achievements, all the options, etc. 500 hours to see everything available. Personally, I don't really care about this claim. But obviously the people clicking on this video might have that in mind, so I wanted to talk about it a bit right here at the beginning. So to answer the first and most obvious question, this wound up taking me a little over 100 hours, about 110, which is obviously dramatically less than the 500 hours that was broadcast. Now, to throw Techland a bone before we dive into that a bit, I would actually say that I did not play this in the capacity of a normal player. I was playing it with the express intention of 100%ing it fairly quickly, but a single very thorough run of the game will only take you probably around 40 to 50 hours, which was obviously my first run through the game. Now, you will have to do a minimum of one more playthrough just to get all the achievements, if that's what 100% means to you specifically. But what's going to take you the longest in this regard is actually the story. There are, I would say, 5 endings, but even those you could largely boil down to 2 endings, with some nuance depending on who survived your playthrough. But trying to avoid spoilers here, so I'm not going to go into a super bunch of depth. But more impactful than the endings are actually some of the choices you'll make throughout the story, which actually do incur some change to the sequence of events, the context of events, cutscenes you may or may not see, etc. But I will say, as someone who's ran through and seen all that stuff, it doesn't really add much to run through the game multiple times to see it. Because at the end of the day, none of these severely impact the game in a significant fashion in terms of gameplay and what you're doing. And while they will affect the story a little bit, pretty much all of them are to the point where you're like, I bet if I did this other thing, this would have happened. And that's pretty much exactly true. Now, honestly, Techland's claim, again, is just something I don't personally care that much about. I don't think most people looked at that claim and either A, considered it a good thing, or B, believed it was true anyway. And even in the context of me admitting that I did this in a way a normal player would not, that is to say speeding through it specifically to see the options several more times, even if I had done a full 100% playthrough in terms of everything you could do in a playthrough every single time, it still would have only come out to like 250 to 300 hours. So in summation, so honestly we can get on with the rest of this review, I think that was just a bit of a silly claim that is quite frankly not true. But honestly, I just wanted to cover it because I figured the people clicking on this might have some questions about it. But with no further ado, let's jump into the actual review here. So the story setup for Dying Light 2 is pretty basic. Rather than try to give a specific ending to the first game, Dying Light 1, which had probably, I would say, 2 primary options for an ending, they kind of sidestepped that completely by basically saying that from Dying Light 1, a proper vaccine was developed for that actual virus. However, the GRE continued experimenting after that vaccine was developed, which a few years later resulted in an even worse virus getting loose and actually destroying the world, bringing about the zombie apocalypse in an event in-game known as the Fall. Now, the game, Dying Light 2, actually takes place 15 years after the Fall, in 2036. And as you might imagine, life has, for the most part, kind of adjusted to the change. To put it in a rather morbid way that you hear in-game, more people actually die from suicide than zombie attacks at this point. In the story, we play as Aiden, who we find out very quickly was involved in some childhood experiments relating to the virus, who was separated from his sister Mia. You've come to the city of Villador, tracking down a lead of sorts about her potential location, as well as the location of the people who performed the experiments. And without getting into spoilers, that's as much as I want to say right now. We will talk a bit more about things like factions, etc. here in a bit though. But first up, I want to talk a bit about character progression. So, as I mentioned, we do play a set protagonist, that is Aiden. But Dying Light 2 is a game that focuses quite a bit on RPG mechanics. And as such, Aiden will have a fairly robust, I would say, character progression that advances in a few different ways. Starters, we have our parkour and our combat skill trees. By engaging in combat or parkour, you will gain the appropriate experience for each tree, and as you rank these skills up, you will get a skill point to spend on various abilities that make combat and parkour easier, granting you more abilities, giving you more ways to traverse the world. In addition to that, we also have Aiden's health and stamina. In order to increase these, it takes a little bit more work. Scattered throughout the world, you will find inhibitors. These are, in theory, what inhibit the virus, preventing you from turning into an actual monster at some point, hence the Stay Human part of the Dying Light 2 title. But every time you get 3 inhibitors, you have the option of either increasing your health or your stamina. Now, this is an interesting one, and there are achievements for maxing out your health or your stamina, but you can't actually do both in one playthrough because there is not enough inhibitors in the world to do so. You can come pretty close, but either your health or stamina or a mix of both is going to be a little bit from the maximum period. Now, I say that right now, there might come DLC later which changes that, but currently that's the way it is. As you use these health and stamina increases, it will affect your player rank. Your player rank is effectively like your level. Every time you increase your health and stamina more and more, you get an incremental increase towards the next player rank. Now that's important because a player rank will actually give you the equivalent of a 1 level up boost to your health and stamina every time your player rank increases. It will also increase the quality of the loot that you will find out in the world. That is to say, the player rank of the loot you find will also be potentially up to your player rank. Because the other part of character progression in this particular game is gear, and not just weapons. In the original Dying Light, your gear progression was basically just weapons. In Dying Light 2 here, we actually have a full gear progression centered around actual gear. That is to say, a headpiece, a chest piece, gloves, shoes, etc. And these are all going to give you appropriate stat buffs or reductions to stamina costs, etc. And some of this gear actually has you taking on a specific role, or at least gives benefits to a particular play style, which is worth mentioning. Let's talk world building a little bit, but before we dive too much into that, I do want to take this time to mention, if you're unaware, Dying Light 2 is fully co-op for the most part. There are very few instances where you cannot be in a co-op session with someone in terms of missions, etc. Much like the first game, a big appeal of this game is that it can be almost entirely played with friends in a co-op manner. You don't have to play it like that in any way, but I would say the long-term success of this game will largely hinge around being able to play with your friends, especially when some of the post-release content starts coming out. Now, probably the first biggest world-building thing I do want to mention beyond that, though, is that this particular game does not see you using any kind of firearms which were present in the first game. So they actually came up with a bit of an in-game reason for this, so there is actually a bit of lore to support it, which again, I don't want to spoil. I actually think that was a fun bit of lore to discover why there don't seem to be any guns in town. But my point is they did actually take the effort to attempt to explain this. That's from a lore perspective. From a purely practical perspective, I suspect they took the guns away because guns pretty much trivialized the difficulty of the original Dying Light. So rather than do that again, they opted for the easier crossbows and bows, etc. types of ranged weapons. So you can still use ranged weapons, they are just decidedly less technologically advanced than firearms. Beyond that, the city we are actually going to be exploring is called Villador. It is divided up into several regions that you gain increasing access to as the story progresses. In fact, you don't get access to a certain part of the city until almost the end of the game. And as you progress the story, you will progressively get more and more tools that will help you explore the world. So whereas some of the tools for city traversal in the original game were tied to your survivor rank, which was equivalent to the player rank, I would say in some ways, but upping your survivor rank, etc. could get you things like the grappling hook that would let you traverse the city much faster. Well, in Dying Light 2, a lot of that is tied to story progression, meaning that if you want to get the most out of your city exploration, it can be worth it to just wait until you get proper access to a lot of the tools, so you don't see yourself returning to the same area just over and over again because you don't have the tools to properly traverse the area. But each of the regions of the city can be captured, so to speak, and given to one of the factions. Now, we'll talk about the factions here in a bit. The thing I want to talk about here is capturing the facilities. So in some ways, these are similar to the towers you would see in other open world games, but largely they are electrical substations or water towers. Now, water towers will see you scaling the water tower and then giving control of that facility to one of two factions. Electrical substations have a sort of mini game where you have to successfully connect pairs of wires to each other in order to power the substation back on. And then you hand control of that facility over to a faction. Capturing one of these major facilities does a few different things for you. For starters, who you give the facility to does actually matter, and it is fairly separate from who you sided with in terms of story, because you can, as the story progresses, side with a faction, so to speak, but instead give all the facilities to a different faction. Bit of a strange choice, but you can do it, is my point. But it's actually very important because giving the facility to one or the other faction grants you different bonuses. Increasing bonuses, actually, because the more regions of the city that faction controls, the more stuff they can set up. So the Peacekeepers are a sort of police faction, and giving them control of facilities will actually give you access to things like traps, etc., that make dealing with zombies or things at nighttime significantly easier. Whereas the other faction, the Survivors, will instead install things that make traversing the city easier, such as trampolines that give you big jumps onto buildings, things that can break your fall, zip lines that go up and down, that type of stuff. Now, generally speaking, I would say it is more advantageous to give things to the Survivors just because, in my opinion, traversing the city faster is a much bigger boon than getting traps and things that apply to zombies that you're not going to be fighting as often. But that is not the only thing capturing these facilities will do for you. In addition to the facilities, there are also windmills scattered throughout each region. If you capture a windmill before you capture the facility, it doesn't do much but provide a safe zone. However, if you capture the facility and then go capture the windmills, or you've already captured the windmills, this will turn the windmills into a sort of small faction hub that might, say, have a merchant as well as a safe zone, etc. So it adds a bit more utility, and can potentially actually unlock some side quests for you as well. Which is nice, honestly, and does kind of give you the feeling of helping rebuild the city and make things better for everyone, honestly, so in that way I kind of appreciated it. Now, you'll notice, though, that I never said capturing any of this stuff actually reveals anything on your map, because it doesn't. What it does do, actually, is give you access to high ground, from which you can use your binoculars to manually mark things on your map. Which, honestly, I appreciate because it gives you a little bit of player agency, even if it really is just kind of the illusion of it. But beyond that, let's talk some slightly less specific stuff in terms of world building and more about just kind of the feel of things. So this world is 15 years after the event, so life has kind of moved on. As I've mentioned, zombie-related deaths to a human are more rare than that person committing suicide. But I would have to imagine the suicide rate in a world like this is a bit high. Again, 15 years later, so a lot of things are set up to facilitate things like parkour, etc. There are structures and things around the city designed with this in mind. Obviously makeshift stuff, but nonetheless, life has gotten to a point where people have accepted this, more or less, and as a result, have kind of leaned into it a bit, and you'll find things that facilitate parkour, etc. around the city, which I thought was a nice touch. And in terms of zombies, we actually have a bit more going on because of the zombies, but more specifically, the zombies have mutated a bit since the first game. This is because, in response to the fall, one of the initial reactions was to drop chemicals on everything. In this particular instance, these chemicals actually mutated the zombies a bit, and this is why you get things like the GRE anomalies, which are basically just souped up zombies in the open world that serve as like little mini boss fights that you can take part in, which will usually reward you with things like inhibitors, etc. Now, they actually also added a small form of fast travel, if you will, to the game through metro stations. So once you reach a certain point in the story, you can start unlocking metro stations, which will effectively unlock a fast travel point. Now, that's significant for a couple reasons, because in the original game, there was no true fast travel. Through a bit of an exploit of how the game spawned you into the game, it was possible to fast travel in a way, but it wasn't ever like set in stone. Whereas in the second game here, if you unlock these metro stations, you can then fast travel to them, which will make your life a lot easier. But you do have to go through the process of actually unlocking the fast travel point, which honestly I thought was a good touch. Beyond that, obviously, we have the new paraglider in terms of world building, and I say that because the world is largely built with that paraglider in mind. Once you get to the point in the story where you get the paraglider, you'll start seeing vents all over the city that have air that will bring you up, and then you can use your paraglider There's a lot of really tall buildings that you can paraglide around with. And again, the city has just kind of adapted to this way of life. And as such, a lot of your exploration is going to be done via paraglider. And while it's a novel enough concept, I would say controlling the paraglider felt consistently clunky no matter how long I played the game. Now, beyond those things, the city is absolutely packed with stuff to find. There's a bunch of great Easter eggs. There's things off the beaten path that you can just kind of discover. If you're up on a building and you see a building that doesn't necessarily have anything marked on it, but you're like, hey, what's over there? I wonder. You can paraglide over there and find out. And usually there is something over there to find, even if it's not explicitly marked. You can find a lot of Easter egg stuff this way. And in that way, the world is very well realized, and I appreciated that. In addition to all of that stuff, another point that I actually liked quite a bit was that a lot of times when you were sitting around one of the main hubs of the game, you would actually find things like the small farms and stuff that they were, making their food out of, etc. And they definitely seemed like they put a lot of thought into how the people of this city were actually getting by. And if you look around, you can actually find the answers to a lot of those questions sitting around. Now, up to this point, I've been pretty nice. But what I will say is that something I really didn't care for, and I noticed it quite a bit, is that in spite of all the good things I just mentioned, we did see a lot of reused assets to get here. Now, in a 100% playthrough, that is to say everything you can do in one playthrough, you're going to notice that a lot of the interiors of buildings are the same. For instance, I mentioned the metro tunnels, which serve as fast travel points. If you go and unlock each and every one of those, the bottom portion of every single metro tunnel is the exact same. You'll have to go down to this map, flip on a few generators sometimes, and every single time you have to do that, the room with the generators in those metro tunnels is the exact same room, which felt honestly pretty lazy. In other places, it's largely the same layout, but there's different stuff laying around, so they at least tried to hide it a little bit. But a lot of the interiors are reused, and you notice it the more you play. Some of that is forgivable, and it is expected. After all, it's an open world game. However, I would say the metro tunnels in particular are probably the most egregious to me, because that is something almost everyone is very likely to go unlock because they're fast travel points, and to have a significant portion of what I would consider a major mission just reuse a map is silly. The last thing I wanted to talk about for world building was the factions themselves. There are 3 of them. You can side with 2 of them. Now, one thing I actually did like about the factions is that they are genuinely morally ambiguous. I would say there's not really a clear-cut case of who is in the right, per se. But the factions themselves are the Peacekeepers and the Survivors, which I've mentioned up to this point. And then there's the Renegades. The Peacekeepers, as I mentioned, are organized. They largely act as police to everyone else. They're very concerned with just keeping everyone safe. Then there are the Survivors. These are basically everyone that isn't the Peacekeepers or the Renegades, as the kind of blanket term Survivors would tell you. In general, just resourceful people who have survived an apocalypse, and your sort of fight the power option. And then we have the Renegades. These primarily serve as antagonists. Later in the game, they seem to attempt to redeem them a little bit, which in my opinion falls kind of flat when they've spent most of the game trying to kill you for no reason. But later in the game, like literally towards the end of the game, they try to humanize this faction and show them as people also just trying to get by, which again falls a little flat when they've spent most of the game just attacking and trying to kill everyone. Now, what I do think was well done about these factions, though, is that, again, it's all kind of morally ambiguous, right? Because it's a post-apocalypse, and as you play through the game, especially multiple times from the angle of different factions, because you can choose to support the Peacekeepers or the Survivors as you play through the game, and seeing that from both angles, if you will kind of give you a lot of potential variance, so to speak, in how you learn about all of the things going on between the factions and between their leaders, and the kind of awful things, honestly, each and every one of them is kind of responsible for. So that part, I think, was actually pretty well done. Now, let's talk about combat a little bit. Now, as you might imagine, it's mostly melee focused, but you can absolutely get ranged weapons. Ranged weapons in general are just very strong simply because you can use them from ranged, and in a melee-dominated world, that's inherently an advantage. I will say on the melee front, somehow they seem to have lost how impactful the melee combat felt from the first game, and I think that's largely down to the RPGification of this particular instance, as this particular game is much more stat-focused than the original was, and as such, they kind of lost some of the visceral grittiness of the melee combat from that first game. which is disappointing, but kind of just where we're at. As I mentioned, this game is a bit more of an RPG, so your combat effectiveness is largely down to your gear setup. What is your actual gear that you're wearing? Your head, your chest, your bracers, etc. Do you have the appropriate stats on for the way that you are playing the game? Are you using the best weapons possible that are appropriate for your player rank? Are you not trying to fight enemies with a rank higher than your rank? Now, beyond that, in terms of combat, well, it is pretty basic, but, honestly still pretty fun because, hack and slash melee stuff. But, there's a lot of killing zombies, which is a classic. I will say that you do fight a lot more humans in this particular game than the first one, and the human enemies are incredibly annoying. They dodge constantly. They seem to know exactly what you're going to do before you do it. And while it's certainly not something that can't be overcome, my point is that human enemies will put up much more of a fight, and you're honestly going to be fighting them a lot, especially as you come up against the renegades, and you do things like take their bandit camps from them, etc. And over time, it just kind of gets annoying. And at the end of the day, there's a few different types of enemies, and they all kind of do the same thing. And once you realize the pattern, you can kind of help yourself out a little bit. But again, the easiest way to deal with this is just ranged weapons, honestly, because most of them can't seem to block that at all, which, is pretty much par for the course. How would you block an arrow in a world where you don't exactly have access to a proper breastplate, But last thing I want to mention on the combat front is that stealth is very effective, provided you can keep your stealth. So if enemies find a body, etc., that will alert the other enemies around them. But if you can stealthily take things out, that will help you out a lot. In fact, you can even stealthily take down zombies. When you enter their areas at nighttime, when most of them are out on the street, some of them will be in their hideout, if you will, sleeping, so you can even stealth take down zombies. And there is absolutely a valid stealth approach to the game, which I thought was, honestly nice, a bit of mix up on the normal stuff, and I think it makes a lot of sense given the context of everything else going on. But yeah, the main thing to know about combat is it's much more stat-focused than the first game, and somehow the melee just feels less impactful, which shocked me a little bit, because the melee combat was one of the best things about the original game, so a bit of a bummer there. While there aren't companions, properly speaking, there is a companion of sorts in the form of Lawan. Lawan is played by Rosario Dawson, which in itself is fine. I will just point out that a bit of my own bias here, I do not enjoy when games just take a celebrity and they make their character that celebrity. Like, it's one thing to use them as a voice actor, but just turning the in-game character into a physical facsimile of that person, I've never liked that. That said, the acting itself, pretty well done, not going to complain there. But this was a big part of the selling point of the game, was that she was in it. And a big point of the plot does actually revolve around your interactions with her as a character, as well as a couple other people, so I wanted to mention it here. In fact, while it's a bit involved, if you want to, you can actually romance, per se, this character, which is more of forming an emotional bond that leads to part of an ending than it is like a proper steamy romance novel or anything, if that's what you're expecting. But nonetheless, it's there. Now, this is normally where I would talk about DLC, but obviously we haven't got to that point in this particular game's life cycle yet, but eventually there will be DLC, but as of right now there isn't, so if you're watching this in the future, that's why. I will cover those in separate videos later. Now, beyond that, let's talk about bugs before we start to wrap this up. I was fortunate enough to not really run into any substantial bugs. I ran into a few minor ones, such as visual bugs, or sometimes I couldn't talk to someone that I needed to talk to, but reloading the game usually fixed that. That said, I am nonetheless aware of a lot of other bugs that people are running into, such as the infinite death loop. You can only keep one save per playthrough, and the game will autosave, etc., so it's very possible to die at an inopportune moment and get stuck in a loop of the game loading you into your death, basically, which is probably the most annoying bug that I've seen, in my opinion. But beyond that, there's stuff like other types of visual bugs, a few different game-breaking bugs. So those things exist. I would say I didn't run into any of them. Most of the stuff I ran into was incredibly minor, but just know that that stuff is out there right now. I know they've already released at least one update for the title since its release, and given the long-term support Techland had for the first game, I would expect those things to be fixed, so play at your own caution in that regard, I suppose. But from there, let's talk some positives, negatives, and then draw our conclusion. So in terms of positives, the game is a lot of fun. Like, the actual gameplay loop and the way you traverse the city with the paraglider, as clunky as it is, it just feels kind of unique, even in comparison to the original game. There's just a lot of fun to be had, and while I don't think it warrants 500 hours of multiple playthroughs, there is something to be said that the core gameplay loop is just fun. Other positives is it is a very large open world with a ton of unique stuff to do. like fighting the GRE anomalies, and while some of it's more stock standard, like fighting bandit camps, etc., I did nonetheless enjoy a lot of those things, and I wanted to mention it here. Now, beyond that, probably the biggest positive in this regard is that it just supports 4-player co-op. So you can, if you want to, just play this with your friends and do all this stuff with your friends, which I don't think gets enough credit in today's gaming world. In a game that is largely single player, if you want it to be, being able to just jump in basically whenever to a 4-player co-op session, I think that's a really cool touch for a game like this, and is a great selling point. Furthermore, the world itself is just well built. I like seeing the world, years away from the event that caused the apocalypse, kind of seeing how the world has got on, how things have kind of settled, if you will, and I appreciated that. But in terms of negatives, probably my biggest negative for this game is that the choices are just simply not that substantial. A great many of the choices, be they at the end of side quests or a lot of times the main missions, they're just very one note. It's like this or that, and you can basically guess what the outcome of the other thing's going to be. And 90% of the time, you would be correct. A lot of times, they don't make a significant difference. A lot of the endings are basically just 2 endings with some nuance. And the other negative is a little difficult to quantify, but I want to mention it nonetheless. The original Dying Light was a very unique game. Like, say what you will about the title itself, but I don't think anyone would deny that Dying Light had a very unique property to it, and I think that's kind of the thing that helped that game's longevity. Whereas in Dying Light 2, while I have no doubt that it will probably do better sales-wise just because of the marketing, etc., I touched on this a little bit already with talking about how the melee combat felt less impactful, and I don't know if this was simply because of the pursuit of the RPGification, if you will, of the title. It just feels like Dying Light 2 lost some of that unique magic from the first game, and while I wouldn't say there's anything particularly egregiously bad about Dying Light 2, in fact, a lot of it is very well done, it just doesn't, again, seem to have that magic from the first game or feel as unique. Again, kind of hard to put that into words, but I hope I made my point clear there. Now, other negatives, obviously the reused maps, that is really annoying to me. I don't like seeing that, especially in such an obvious way. Like, you expect it in small areas, sure, but to just put that in a pretty blatantly obvious main part of the game, like unlocking fast travel points, seemed like a poor decision. And then for me, the final negative was the tying a lot of the exploration-related tools behind story progression. Like, you don't get the grappling hook until pretty late in the game, and it's a pretty significant part of getting around some of the areas of the city, which is frustrating. And it just felt like that came way later in the game than it really should have. For me, that was a negative. Now, to draw a conclusion here. The game is normally $60, which is a pretty standard price on Steam in the US. There is the Deluxe Edition, which comes with 1 future DLC for $80, or a Ultimate Edition, which is $100, which comes with the Season Pass, effectively. That will grant you the 2 story DLCs they are planning in the future, as well as some pre-ordery type stuff. And while overall I would say there's enough content here to more than warrant that the price isn't egregious for the amount of content you're getting, I would say personally though, I would maybe hold off for a little bit until some of the more egregious bugs have already passed, basically. Because at the end of the day, if you waited to watch this review, I imagine you're waiting to buy it nonetheless. So if you're watching this exclusively to make a purchasing decision, I would wait a month or two and wait for some of these bigger bugs to get ironed out. Because if I got caught in an infinite death loop, I would be very incredibly annoyed. But overall, is the game worth the money? Yeah, I would definitely say so. I don't think it's going to be everybody's cup of tea. It's a pretty significant departure from the first game, which at the end of the day is just not going to please everyone. That's the way it goes with sequels, But overall, in terms of the price for what you're getting, yeah, I don't think it's a bad deal at all. There you go, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, let me know how you feel about it down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching, especially if you're listening to this message. This was probably a pretty long one. But nonetheless, thank you for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.